Today, the focus of our knowledge burst is on planning for adulthood. And you'll see that in parts I will focus on that secondary transition piece, which federally is generally defined as starting at age 16 for a student with a disability who has an individualized education program or IEP. In Pennsylvania and in many other states, it's actually mandated to start earlier at age 14. But what I remind all of the teachers in training or teachers that I work with is that transition doesn't magically start when a student becomes a teenager. One, we want to be laying the building blocks for that across a student's full educational experience, so as early as preschool, but also the idea that a student actually experiences many different educational transitions throughout their career. So today we'll talk about that. But to backtrack, I introduced myself. I'm Katie Burke. I'm from Temple University, and my work focuses all around special education. So I'll be talking about a lot of things from the school-based perspective, but what I hope is that a lot of this information can be informative for you all as family members and others supporting loved ones in this way. So next slide, please. So educational transition. When we think about the word transition, we think about change. A transition is a change. What's hard about a transition? Well, educationally, it means that a student is likely going to experience having different classmates and peers. So new social dynamics to get used to, new relationships to build, different teachers and staff. So similarly, getting used to new people in a supporting role who may not know them as well, or may have different approaches to what they do, and different physical environments that can be hard for individuals, as well as different expectations. So every transition does come with quite a bit of adjustment. One of the most consistent things you'll hear in terms of how to make educational transitions successful is preparation. Planning ahead so that it does not come as a shock or something sudden that the student was not aware was going to happen. Today, we'll talk about some of the ways in which families can be meaningfully involved and support students with educational transitions. Okay, so this is a bit of a long excerpt, but I thought it was important to include as we talk about where does a student's involvement in their own transitions come in. So I'm going to go ahead and read this out loud for accessibility. Transition is kind of a huge deal. So when we planned his transition to adulthood, we were doing a move, a change of schools, and a change of jobs all at once. We decided upfront that self-determination was going to be an integral part of the transition process. We set everything up so Michael could make choices and everything would be with his interests and preferences in mind. We went slowly. First, we just did weekends at the new location. When we actually made the move, we took him to the new school. He started his new job, and we noticed almost no behavior problems. When we had transitions in the past, like going from elementary to middle school, we've had no sleep, screaming, and aggression. But this transition was different because we built in Michael's self-determination. We focused on his choices and preference, even his preferences for going slowly. After we made the move, there were still so many changes, but he was fine. He was able to handle all of them. I think that's the power of self-determination. So while self-determination isn't going to be the focus of our conversation today when we talk about transition, we actually have done another session focused more explicitly on that, where you can learn more about how to support skills and abilities associated with self-determination. Those are things like self-advocacy, choice-making, decision-making, problem-solving, planning, self-management. But the piece is that even for all of us in a supporting role, we always want the transition process, no matter where it's from and where it's going to revolve around what that person or young person in particular wants and needs. Next slide, please. Okay, so I do want to talk a bit about regulations as it pertains to educational transitions. The primary federal policy that allows for special education services and supports is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, with which you may be familiar. Two big transitions are highlighted under IDEA. First, that's the transition from early intervention to early childhood special education. This is initially addressed in a child's individualized family service plan. Some of you may even have those, or IFSP. But when a child becomes school age, it transitions to an individualized education program, or IEP. The other big transition period that's focused on under IDEA is when a student prepares to transition from high school, whether that's ending at 12th grade, like we talked about, or extending into what are called 18 through 21 services, into adult life. And that gets addressed in the IEP with the understanding that a student may or may not be moving into some systems of adult services and supports, which have their own corresponding kind of framework. So we'll dive into each of these a bit deeper. Next slide, please. Okay, so talking a little bit about this early age transition. When a student is transitioning from early intervention to school age, this is framed around when a child turns age 3. So what's mandated under IDEA is that the planning must begin at least 90 days or more, so at least 3 months before the child is going to turn age 3. This IFSP must contain a plan to transition away from those Part C services, which is what they had been receiving as being infant to age 3, to an IEP or individualized education program. This will guide the educational programming, services, and supports a student receives throughout their educational experience. So this is one of several formal ways in which educational transitions are supported. Next slide, please. Okay, so secondary transitions. And I just want to note, I was glad everyone shared the ages in the chat because we've got the full span. I see we have people with children as young as 3 all the way up to age 20. So I'm hoping that we're covering quite a bit of this landscape for you all. Secondary transition services are a required component of special education services for a student with an IEP by age 16. And I already mentioned it's earlier depending on the state. So in Pennsylvania, we're age 14. There are 3 areas that must be covered, and this really relates to our case. Those are post-secondary education, employment and vocational training, and independent living, which is labeled as if appropriate. I always make the case as a special educator that I believe independent living is an appropriate goal area to be discussing with every student with an IEP and with every student with or without an IEP for that matter. But that's my 2 cents and how I train our teachers at Temple. So why are these areas and why is transition so important? Unfortunately, we do continue to see data that shows us that students with disabilities experience significantly poorer post-school outcomes than their peers without disabilities. And I don't say this to be all doom and gloom. I say it so that we can be prepared to plan so that these outcomes are not what occur. These are things like higher dropout rates, lower rates of higher education enrollment, lower rates of employment, and less likelihood of living independently. Next slide, please. So what can we do? One of the biggest factors that has been shown to relate to more positive post-school outcomes for students with disabilities is family involvement in transition planning. Here, I am mostly talking about family involvement in secondary transition planning, so ages 14 through 21. But I will note that all of these principles have direct application to what we're talking about in earlier educational transitions as well. So here on the screen, you'll see a visual that is the family systems framework. And this is all about how a family's makeup and functioning relates to how they engage in supporting a student in their transition. We talk about family characteristics. This is taking into consideration a family's cultural and social characteristics, the roles that different family members take on in their family and outside their family, the demands placed upon the family, maybe some personal characteristics. Those can be things like race, ethnicity, gender, disability, socioeconomic status. Well, that wouldn't fall into personal characteristics, but that's also a relevant factor. We need to note that something you will consistently see in transition planning, at least, is that under IDEA, things were initially written from a dominant culture perspective. While there have been significant strides made in our field for more culturally sustaining practices, that remains something that needs to be worked on. When a family is a meaningful part of the process, though, they can take time to explain their family's culture, to share more, and the student can then advocate for things that they do or don't want in their transition plan that might differ from other peers because of their culture. It's also important to understand family interaction How much is it a priority that the student become independent versus planning for ongoing interdependence, which is something that many of us benefit from. The family life cycle. This relates to the fact that transition is a process, not an outcome. So just as things change in a family over time, transitioning will change over time, whether that's a transition from early childhood into school age or at other periods. And then lastly, I'll just note family functions. A family has many different functions for individuals, for one another, and then how they engage with the outside world. And it really comes down to balancing immediate family needs and long-term goals for the student. These are all things you can be thinking about as family members when you think about the big picture of transitions. So I wanted to frame our conversation around this. Next slide, please. But really the big question and kind of the purpose for us here today is to talk about what can you do to support your student to prepare for an educational transition, whether that's preschool to kindergarten, whether that's elementary to middle, whether that's middle school to high school, or whether that's high school into the adult world, or simply just a change in a classroom, a change in a teacher. There are a few things that have been shown, again, similarly from research to be effective for the best thing families can do in successfully supporting transitions for their child. The first is acknowledging and naming the fact that transitioning is a time of stress and uncertainty. I think preparing your child that things will feel different. Things might be hard for a time, but that things will get better, that supports are in place, and that you want to hear from them about how things are going. Next is engaging with and supporting your child. Parental involvement in transition planning is one of the biggest indicators of successful transition outcomes for students. When a family is meaningfully involved, a child is more likely to feel supported. The school may have a better understanding of the vision for the future of this child from them and from their family. Another huge piece that I'm a big advocate of is keeping expectations high. We want to avoid placing limits that have possibly been kind of understood because of historical understandings of possible limitations related to disability. We now know that, the world is their oyster. Each and every child should have the full range of options available to them. It may be that they will have different supports. It may look a bit different than it might for a peer, but those expectations can remain high, that a person can work, that a person can continue in school, that they can engage in the type of community living and participation of their choosing, as long as we continue to reiterate that message and support them along the way. The next is collaborating with your school. My entire transition course for teachers is focused on them doing the other side of that, collaborating with families in the transition process. And so know that the vast majority of educators you meet are going to be excited and ready to collaborate with you in the transition process, and they want to hear from you. Let them know what your preferred communication method and style is. They understand that you may have a busy work schedule, you may have other family members to think about, but they want you to engage in that process. Next, follow up on resources and supports. You will have a lot of information coming at you. We've talked in other sessions about things people have found helpful for how they manage their materials that they're receiving. Some people keep a binder, others keep a file folder, others have something set up on their computer. But having the information ready, because you will hear about not only school-based services and supports, but also things that relate to being outside of school. We talked about the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation today. You may hear about Medicaid waiver funding, all types of things that are helpful to know that can often put the pieces of the puzzle related to transition together. And the last piece I want to advocate for is to continue to remember to take care of you. Transitions are a time of change, and they are not just stressful and uncertain for a child, they're also that way for families. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that, but figure out what's going to work for you to feel your best and be able to support your family member. I always appreciate the saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think that's very much true when it comes to educational transitions, because it's not a one and done thing. It's something that will continue to occur, and it really and truly is a process. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share a few family resources, and the resources I have really do go across age ranges. So here on the screen, I have a screenshot of a resource from PTAN, which is the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. They provide a lot of materials related to secondary transition. They have different kind of 1 to 2 page documents that go over things like customized employment, 2 or 4 year college, financial fundamentals, importance of employment, and job skills. And what I really like about these is these are called discussion starters. So these are designed to be something you as a family member review and then use to talk with your child or your loved one about these things. And we'll have these linked with our resources from today. Next slide, please. On the next slide, I have links from that relate to a few other age ranges. So Disability Rights Pennsylvania does a really nice job of providing more information on what the transition process looks like to adulthood, and then also resources, supports, and related rights, as you might think. A few other things I highlighted, though, relate to different types of transition. So the Peel Center, which is the Parent Education and Advocacy. I'm trying to think of the L, but it's our Parent Training and Information Center here in Pennsylvania, has a program called Transition Discoveries. In addition to partnering with your school about what they're planning to do, it is okay to come to your school with ideas. Hey, I heard about this initiative. Hey, I heard about this programming. Is this something we could think about? Is this something that we could look at? And then I have two other resources from autism-specific organizations. Thank you. L is for leadership. One is on tips for transitioning from high school, and the other is on early intervention to school-age programs. So these are designed as very ready-to-use materials on what can you do right now if a transition is coming. Next slide, please. I believe that's all the information I had there for our knowledge burst, but I would love to hear if anyone has any questions.